What if I told you that your last name might be a lie? Not a lie you told, but a lie forced upon your family more than 150 years ago. Millions of African Americans are now discovering their true ancestral origins through DNA testing. And what they're finding is absolutely transforming how they understand who they really are. This isn't just about genealogy. This is about justice, identity, and the restoration of dignity to people whose histories were deliberately erased. When most people think about African American surnames, they imagine a simple story. They believe that when enslaved people were freed, they took the last names of their former slave owners. It's a narrative so widely accepted, so deeply embedded in how we understand American history that almost nobody questions it anymore. Teachers teach it. Historians write about it. Documentaries present it as established fact. It's become conventional wisdom, but the real story is far more complex, far more nuanced, and absolutely fascinating when you examine the actual historical evidence. The myth has persisted for so long because it seems logical. If a white plantation owner had power over enslaved people, wouldn't they have forced them to take their surname? In some cases, yes, but that's only part of the story. And the part that gets ignored is where DNA comes in and changes everything we thought we knew. The truth is that not all African Americans who were freed took their master's surname. In fact, a significant number didn't. Some held onto names that had been passed down through generations on plantations and farms, names that were hidden from official records, names that slave owners themselves didn't even know existed. Others chose completely new surnames, names that represented their newfound freedom, names that connected them to biblical stories of liberation, or names that simply held personal significance to them. This is where DNA enters the story in the most powerful way imaginable. Modern genetic testing has opened a door that was previously locked shut. It's allowing millions of African Americans to look backward through time, past the brick wall of slavery, past the erasure of records, past the deliberate destruction of documentation, and connect with their true ancestral origins. And what they're discovering is rewriting our entire understanding of African American history and identity. Think about this carefully. When enslaved Africans arrived on American shores, they came with names, real names, names that meant something in their native languages, names that connected them to their families, their villages, their ethnic groups, their clans, names that carried histories and meanings that spanned generations. But all of that was systematically stripped away. Slave traders and owners gave them new names. Sometimes these were simple English names like John or Mary. Sometimes they were classical names like Caesar or Nero. Sometimes they were purely utilitarian, almost dehumanizing in their randomness. And in doing so, they severed a connection that seemed like it could never be recovered through documents alone. For nearly 200 years, African Americans trying to trace their roots hit what genealogists call the brick wall of slavery. The year 1870 marked the first time African Americans appeared by name in the federal census. Anything before that was like trying to read a book with most of the pages torn out. Slave schedules from 1850 and 1860 existed, yes, but they listed enslaved people by age and physical description, not by name. They were recorded as property, not as people with identities and histories. Finding your ancestors before 1870 felt almost impossible using traditional research methods. But then, DNA testing changed everything fundamentally. It opened up an entirely new dimension of genealogical research that went beyond paper trails and historical records. It allowed researchers to work with genetics itself, with the actual biological blueprint that connects us across centuries and continents. Suddenly, the impossible became possible. Why DNA testing became particularly revolutionary for this specific work. Here's why it matters so much. When researchers examine the Y chromosome, they're looking at a genetic marker that passes from father to son almost unchanged, generation after generation. It's a direct patrilineal line stretching back thousands of years. It's like a biological thread connecting you directly to your paternal ancestors. And this is where things get incredibly interesting for African Americans specifically. Many African Americans, when they underwent Y-DNA testing, discovered something shocking and historically significant. Their Y chromosome was of European origin, not African. European. At first, this seemed to contradict everything people thought they knew. How could an African American have a European Y chromosome? The answer was uncomfortable, but historically important. During slavery, white slave owners regularly fathered children with enslaved African women. This wasn't rare or exceptional. It was systematic. It was part of the power structure and hierarchy of slavery itself. It was built into the system, and the genetic evidence remains in the DNA of their descendants today. But here's the crucial part that changes everything. Since the Y chromosome follows the same patrilineal inheritance pattern as surnames typically do in many cultures, this genetic marker could be used to identify and connect to the slaveholding ancestors to whom their direct paternal ancestors belonged. In many cases, this allowed researchers to finally crack through that brick wall of 1870 by identifying the specific plantation, the specific slaveholder, and sometimes even the specific white man who had fathered children with their enslaved ancestors. One of the most famous examples of this happened with Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. For decades, historians argued about whether Jefferson had fathered children with his enslaved woman Sally Hemings. The historical evidence suggested it, but there was no definitive proof. Then DNA testing provided irrefutable confirmation. A male descendant of Eston, Hemings, Sally's youngest child, was tested and found to share the exact same Y chromosome signature as descendants of Thomas Jefferson's uncle. This wasn't circumstantial evidence. This wasn't speculation or inference. This was genetic proof that linked two branches of a family that had been artificially separated by slavery and race. The discovery essentially forced historians to rewrite what they thought they knew about one of America's founding fathers. But the story of DNA and African American ancestry goes far beyond just identifying those who enslaved our ancestors. Autosomal DNA testing, which looks at the entire genome rather than just one line, has allowed millions of African Americans to see where their ancestors came from. These tests provide ethnicity estimates. They show percentages of ancestry from different regions of Africa, from Europe, from Asia, from the Americas. They reveal a complex tapestry of ancestral origins that is often surprising. And this is where the mystery of surnames becomes even more important to understand. Because here's what researchers discovered through careful analysis. Many common African American surnames don't have the origins that people assumed. Some came from slave owners, yes, but others came from previous slave owners. Historical records show that freed people often went back as far as they could in their family history to reclaim a surname from an earlier enslaver. They wanted to preserve what they could of their family's actual history, not just adopt the name of whoever happened to own them at the moment of emancipation. Others chose surnames that were completely new to their families. These were names chosen by people experiencing freedom for the first time in their lives. Some chose biblical names: Moses, Freeman, Washington, Lincoln. These were names laden with symbolism, names that represented liberation, spirituality, or aspirational connection to nation builders. The name Moses became particularly popular because Moses led his people out of bondage and religious tradition. It was a name that carried spiritual and historical weight. People understood the significance immediately. Some chose occupational surnames: Smith, Miller, Cooper. These were names that represented skills and potential for earning a living in the newly freed society. Some chose surnames based on traits or characteristics they possessed. Some chose names they simply liked the sound of. The diversity of naming choices reflects the diversity of human experience at the moment of emancipation. When you were finally free to choose your own name, what would you choose? What would it mean to have that power? What makes this also relevant today is that modern genealogists have learned to use this knowledge in combination with DNA testing to crack through mysteries that seemed completely unsolvable just a decade ago. A genealogist might take an African American client's DNA results, identify genetic matches, and then work backward through those matches' family trees. They look for patterns. They look for clustered surnames in specific regions during specific time periods. They cross-reference with slave schedules, plantation records, probate documents, ship manifests, and census records. One research method that's proven especially effective is called cluster genealogy. This involves mapping out not just your direct ancestors, but the entire social network around them. Your ancestors didn't live in isolation. They lived in communities. They had neighbors. They had friends and acquaintances. They had family members who were separated and scattered during slavery, but might have reconnected afterward. By looking at the entire cluster of people around your ancestor, not just your direct line, genealogists can triangulate information. They can verify connections. They can find names in documents where a surname alone might appear hundreds of times in a county. But cluster genealogy doesn't work in a vacuum. It needs to be combined with other research methods. Oral history is crucial. Many African American families have stories passed down through generations about their ancestors. These stories might mention a plantation name, a former master's name, a location, a region. Older family members might remember hearing about ancestors who had different surnames, or about family members who were sold away, or about specific places where family roots lay. Recording these stories and treating them as serious historical evidence, combined with DNA testing and documentary research, creates a powerful research toolkit. Family stories that seemed like folklore or legend suddenly take on new meaning when they're confirmed by DNA evidence. A grandmother's story about being descended from a specific tribe in Africa can be verified through DNA matches to modern Africans from that region. A family tradition that a certain ancestor was the child of the slave owner can be proven through Y-DNA testing. The combination of oral tradition, DNA science, and documentary evidence creates a kind of historical triangulation that's incredibly powerful. DNA has made this work exponentially more powerful and efficient. When you test your DNA and receive matches, you're not getting matches based on coincidental name overlap. You're getting biological confirmation that you share actual ancestry with that person. When multiple people with different surnames, living in different places, all show up as DNA matches, and all show up in the genealogical records of a specific plantation during a specific time period, that's not coincidence. That's evidence. That's proof. The Freedmen's Bank records have become invaluable for this research work, too. After the Civil War ended, the government established the Freedmen's Savings Bank to help formerly enslaved people save money and build wealth. Bank records captured detailed information about thousands of African Americans right after emancipation. They recorded their names, occupations, family relationships, and sometimes even their previous enslavers' names. These records are extraordinary resources because they're often the first official documentation of African Americans by their own chosen names. When you combine Freedmen's Bank records with DNA matches and census records, the fog starts to lift. Family trees that seemed impossible to construct suddenly become visible and documented. Beyond Freedmen's Bank records, genealogists also use slave schedules from the 1850 and 1860 censuses. Though these documents are painful to examine because they list enslaved people as property, they're crucial historical records. They show enslaved people listed by age and sometimes physical description, grouped by their owner. By cross-referencing these schedules with the 1870 census, where people are finally listed by name, researchers can identify who someone's enslaved ancestors were. Plantation records, when they survive, provide similar information. Church records often documented marriages and baptisms of enslaved people, creating another layer of documentation. Probate records sometimes listed enslaved people by name in wills and estate inventories. Researchers also consult shipping manifests from slave ships. Though these records exist for fewer enslaved Africans than most people realize, bills of sale document purchases of enslaved people. Newspaper advertisements sometimes listed runaway slaves with physical descriptions that can be matched to individuals in other records. Court records occasionally mention enslaved people by name. Land records sometimes identify who lived on specific plantations. All of these sources, when layered together with DNA evidence, create a comprehensive picture of how families were formed, separated, and sometimes reunited. But DNA does something else that's equally powerful and transformative. It provides ethnicity estimates that can connect African Americans not just to countries, but sometimes to specific ethnic groups and regions within Africa. This is remarkable because it represents a reversal of what happened during slavery. Slavery stripped away ethnic identity. It treated all Africans as interchangeable property. It deliberately tried to erase tribal and ethnic consciousness. But DNA can sometimes restore what was lost. A genetic match to someone from Nigeria who belongs to a specific ethnic group can suggest that your paternal ancestor might have come from that same group, or a mitochondrial DNA match can suggest maternal ancestry from a particular region. The science here is nuanced and requires careful interpretation and expertise. Identical mitochondrial DNA haplotypes can sometimes be shared among many ethnic groups across different parts of Africa, so you can't always pinpoint an exact origin with certainty. But patterns emerge when you have multiple matches, multiple genetic markers, and historical context about the slave trade routes and which African regions were most heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Historians and geneticists have mapped out which African regions supplied most of the enslaved people brought to America. The Grain Coast, which included Senegal, Gambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and parts of Liberia. The Windward Coast, which was modern-day Ivory Coast and Liberia. The Gold Coast, which was Ghana, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, Central Africa, including Gabon, Congo, and Angola. Southern coastal regions from the Cape of Good Hope to Cape Delgado. These regions accounted for the vast majority of African people forcibly transported to America. When your DNA suggests ancestry from one of these regions, and when your surname has historical documentation connecting to a plantation in a particular area, and when you have DNA matches to people from specific ethnic groups in those regions, the connections become remarkably clear. What's particularly powerful about recent DNA research is how it's being applied to entire communities rather than just individual families. Studies of African Americans from the Lowcountry region of South Carolina have revealed ancestral connections to specific African ethnic groups and even to individual plantations. Researchers have been able to connect living African Americans to both enslaved ancestors and to their African-born relatives who were never enslaved because their branch of the family wasn't sold into slavery. This is remarkable historical work that's being pioneered by researchers at major universities and genealogical organizations. The major DNA testing companies like Ancestry, DNA, 23andMe, and MyHeritage have all become crucial tools in this research. Each has massive databases containing millions of DNA samples. Ancestry DNA has the largest database, with tens of millions of people having tested. This means more. Potential matches for African Americans seeking to connect with cousins they never knew existed. The larger the database, the better the chances of finding genetic connections that can lead to ancestral discoveries. And as more people test, the power of these tools increases exponentially. Beyond the commercial DNA testing companies, specialized genealogy platforms like Family Tree DNA have focused specifically on Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA testing, which are particularly valuable for tracing specific ancestral lines. These specialized tests cost less and provide very specific information about paternal and maternal lineages. For African Americans trying to trace enslaved ancestors, these specific lineage tests can be absolutely crucial. They can pinpoint exactly which African ethnic group your direct maternal ancestors came from, or which male ancestor fathered a line of descendants through generations. Imagine that for a moment. You do a DNA test. You get a match to someone in modern-day Cameroon. You share a small amount of DNA which suggests a common ancestor from the early 1700s. You message this person, and you learn they belong to a specific clan and ethnic group. Your shared ancestor was born in Africa, lived in Africa, and their children followed different paths. One branch was stolen and enslaved in America. The other stayed free in Africa. Now, more than 300 years later, DNA has reunited these branches of the family. It's provided something that seemed lost forever: a sense of place, a sense of belonging, a sense of genuine ancestral connection. Of course, this research isn't simple or straightforward. African American genealogy has unique challenges that don't exist to the same degree in other communities. Slavery itself was a chaotic and brutal system that frequently separated families and caused people to have multiple surnames throughout their lives. A child born on one plantation might have had one surname, but if they were sold to a different plantation, they might have been given a new name. If that person had children with someone from another plantation, those children might have been given yet another name. After emancipation, people might have changed their surnames again. The same person might have used different surnames in different census records. Additionally, there were forced population mixtures that genealogists call endogamy. Because enslaved people were forcibly confined to plantations and limited in who they could marry, there was often genetic intermarriage between distant relatives. This can create false relationships when genetic tests show that you're more closely related to someone than you actually are, genealogically speaking. It takes careful analysis and extensive family tree research to sort through these complications and understand what the DNA is really showing. But none of this has deterred the massive surge in interest in African American genealogy. Millions of African Americans have taken DNA tests in recent years. Online genealogy communities have exploded in size and activity. Forums dedicated to African American ancestry research are bustling with people sharing documents, comparing DNA matches, and collaborating to solve family mysteries. There's an energy and momentum in these communities that's inspiring. Some of the most popular surnames among African Americans, surnames that appear hundreds of thousands of times across the country, have complex and sometimes surprising origins. Take the Johnson surname, incredibly common among African Americans, but many African Americans with the Johnson surname have discovered, through careful research and DNA analysis, that they don't all descend from a single Johnson. Instead, they descend from multiple Johnson families, sometimes Johnson slaveholders in different regions, sometimes from different sources entirely. The surname became so common that it obscured the actual family connections. Similar patterns emerge with other common surnames: Williams, Brown, Davis, Smith, Miller. These surnames were so common that they became nearly impossible to track using traditional genealogy methods without DNA. But DNA has changed that game completely. Now researchers can look at a specific Brown family in Georgia, a specific Smith family in North Carolina, a specific Davis family in Mississippi, and through genetic triangulation and documented records, prove that these families are indeed related to one another, connecting branches that had been scattered and lost for 150 years. The work of genealogists in this field has become increasingly sophisticated and scientifically rigorous. They're using chromosome mapping tools that show exactly which parts of your DNA you share with matches. This is called chromosome painting, and it's transformative. It allows researchers to see not just that you share DNA with someone, but exactly where on which chromosome that DNA is shared. When multiple people share overlapping DNA segments, you can triangulate back to a specific common ancestor. It's detective work that would have seemed impossible just 15 years ago. What's remarkable is how this technology is being deployed not just for individual family research, but for community healing and historical understanding. Universities are partnering with African American communities to conduct large-scale studies that combine DNA analysis with archival research. The goal isn't just to create individual family trees, but to reconstruct entire communities of enslaved people, to reconnect modern African Americans with the specific places where their ancestors were enslaved, and to restore some measure of dignity and documentation to people who were deliberately erased from history. One particularly moving example comes from research at an early ironworks site where enslaved people worked. Researchers took DNA samples from modern descendants of enslaved workers and used advanced genetic analysis to connect them with documentary evidence of their ancestors. The method involved analyzing DNA segments shared among multiple people that were inherited from recent common ancestors. By doing this systematically across a community, researchers could prove relationships and create family networks that had been completely invisible in written records. The implications of all this extend far beyond genealogy itself. They touch on identity, on justice, on reparations, on education, and on how we understand American history. If you can prove exactly which plantation your ancestors were enslaved on, if you can identify the specific white family who enslaved them, if you can connect that information to modern descendants of those families, it changes the conversation about accountability. It makes slavery concrete rather than abstract. It makes it impossible to distance oneself from the reality of what happened. Some African Americans use this information to visit the places where their ancestors were enslaved. Others use it to contact descendants of the families who enslaved their ancestors. These conversations can be difficult and emotional, but they can also be transformative. They can create space for acknowledgement, for understanding, for something that approaches healing. The technology continues to improve dramatically. DNA databases grow larger every year, which means more potential matches, more ability to find genetic cousins, more opportunity for connection. New analytical methods are being developed that can extract information from smaller DNA segments. Ancient DNA research is also informing modern African American genealogy, as scientists study the genetic signatures of ancient Africans and learn more about population movements, migrations, and intermixture over thousands of years. Perhaps most importantly, what all of this research has proven is something profound about human resilience and identity. Slavery tried to erase all of that. It tried to reduce people to anonymous commodities, to strip away all connection to ancestry, to make it impossible for descendants to know where they came from. For centuries, it seemed like slavery had succeeded in the terrible goal. The brick wall of 1870 felt impenetrable. But DNA doesn't lie. DNA doesn't forget. Embedded in every cell of your body is a record that stretches back thousands of years. Every person you're related to, every migration your ancestors made, every mixture of populations that created you, it's all written in your genetic code. Technology has finally given us the ability to read that code, to understand it, to use it to restore what was taken. So if you have one of those common surnames, if you have roots in the American South, if your family history seemed to begin abruptly in 1870 with freed people in a census, this is your opportunity. DNA testing isn't just about curiosity or genealogy. It's about reclamation. It's about refusing the erasure that slavery imposed. It's about looking into the past and saying, my ancestors were real. They had names, they had families, they had identities. They came from somewhere, and I'm going to find them. The story of slavery and African American surnames is deeply painful. But the story of how DNA is allowing people to recover their ancestry, to reconnect with African origins, to understand their place in a global network of human family, that's a story of hope. That's a story of resilience. That's a story about the power of science and human determination to overcome one of history's greatest traumas. And that story is still being written. Every time someone takes a DNA test, every time a genealogist solves a family mystery, every time an African American connects with a distant cousin in Africa or discovers the exact region where their maternal ancestors came from, the story continues. It's a story about reclaiming identity, restoring dignity, and proving that some bonds cannot be broken, some history cannot be truly erased, and some truths will eventually be revealed, no matter how long they were hidden. As technology advances, the possibilities expand. Larger DNA databases mean more potential matches. Better analytical tools mean more accurate results. International collaboration means African Americans can connect not just with cousins in America, but with relatives in Africa whose families followed different historical paths. The work continues to grow and evolve, reaching deeper into the past and broader across the global African diaspora. This is your moment, your chance to reclaim your true story.